Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Orbit Live event. It's a Halloween Witch Extravaganza. I'm thrilled to be joined tonight by three extraordinary authors. Alix Harrow is the author of The Once and Future Witches, out this month from Redbook, as well as the Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Award nominated The 10,000 Doors of January. Ooh, I'm getting some feedback. Are you all getting that feedback too?
I am.
Connie, I wonder if you might want to put in those headphones after all.
And she's muted now.
Yes, I did that. That was on purpose.
Is it?
Yeah, it's still doing it.
I don't.
Oh.
Wow, that's more dramatic than it's ever been.
Yeah, that's really dramatic.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't mind just muting yourself while other people are talking, that'll probably handle it. All right. Sorry about the technical difficulties, everyone. We'll try to figure this out as we go. So to continue the introductions, Constance Sayers is the author of A Witch in Time, as well as the upcoming The Ladies of the Secret Circus. And Louisa Morgan is the author of several novels, including A Secret History of Witches, The Witch's Kind, and most recently, The Age of Witches. If you haven't already picked these up, click on the button at the bottom of the screen that says Buy the Author's Books. Alix, Constance, and Louisa will be talking about their books, The Everlasting Appeal of Witches, and what witches have to do with women's rights and women's power. A bit later on, they'll also be answering your questions. Click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen to add one to the list, or to vote on the questions that have already been submitted by other attendees. We'll answer questions with the most votes first, so put in your votes. Good practice for the voting you'll all be doing later this week or next week. Finally, don't forget to follow us on Crowdcast if you'd like to be notified about future Orbit Live events. In November, we'll be welcoming fantasy authors R.J. Barker and Kaysen Callender to the virtual stage. And now I am pleased to turn things over to Alix, Constance, and Louisa, and I'm going to kick things off with a first question to all of you, which is, why witches? What is it about them that has tapped your imagination?
I'll jump in and go first because I'm that kind of a person. So for me, and I'm curious to know what Louisa's going to answer because she's been doing witches for much longer than I have. You have done many witches. But for me, I feel like the thing that fantasy does best, that makes fantasy really exciting to me, is the way it can turn invisible and metaphorical things visible. It can make a metaphor literal. So when you talk about like women's social political power, that is something that is often invisible and hidden, and you can't see the right to vote. But I think through fantasy and through witchcraft, you kind of can take it literally. Like women's power becomes an actual power that they have. And I think kind of living in the post-2016 / majority of Western history world as a femme-presenting person, I think that has a huge appeal for me.
I think that covers it really well. I do want to say that witches exist in every culture, so it's not just, and of course witches are not always female in many cultures, but in our culture they are overwhelmingly female. There were men in the early centuries of persecution that were persecuted as witches, whatever they called them, would be different languages in any case. But it is really all about finding power. And so I just got started writing witches because I wanted to write. I had been writing historical fiction, and I wanted to write historical fiction with witches who fight against the patriarchy, and really they had no other power. And if they had managed to have some inherited magical ability, they could use that. But I always stress that my witches are working witches. It's not like there's no magic wands. You learn things and you exercise your knowledge and apply it. And it takes a lot of strength of will. So it's not just something, it's not the Cinderella kind where it just happens to you. It is a magic that these women take control of and use with knowledge and strength, not just happenstance.
I'm sorry.
Poor Constance.
Oh no, if you want to keep experimenting with tech, I wanted to jump in there really quickly and say that the idea of work and witchcraft being tied was maybe my favorite part of the book Circe, the Madeline Miller book. I don't know if you've read that, but it
Not
is
yet.
gorgeous and wonderful.
it?
And of course, it's one of my favorite new books. And just of course, it's like one of the most famous witches in our collective mythology, right? But the way she presents witchcraft as hard work that you learn slowly and that usually comes with kind of a set of costs is really beautiful. All right, you want to try again?
Now I don't know if she can. Poor Constance.
Can you hear us?
Are you there, Connie?
She can't make it work. Ah, too bad. Should we move on to another question while Constance is still struggling? I'm sorry. I'm wondering why all of us wrote about witches in a historical context. So not in, actually, I almost, in the secret history of witches, I almost get up to the present day, but lots of historical. And I'm wondering what the appeal of that is. I know for myself what it is, but how do we arrive at that choice?
For me, at least, I think that our collective folklore about witches does tend to be historical, even though there are plenty of practicing witches out there right now.
Yes.
I don't know if they've entered into the popular imagination in the same way, but I also think there's genuinely something sort of generational about witchcraft and the way that it is, like you were saying, a set of like something that you would learn and knowledge you would acquire, and I think that is something we see as being passed down and having roots. And I do think it sort of naturally roots itself in generations, typically of women. But
and isn't it
yeah.
interesting, since we're talking about it as a historical artifact, that paganism, or I should say modern Wicca, wasn't really even established until the 40s and 50s, which tells me that there was already this need, this wish to revisit those traditions, which I
But I
find
love
absolutely
that.
fascinating. I do too.
I love that, not just because like there's sort of a neo-pagan, a sudden new movement, but also that
Right.
like it must have coexisted with all of those older forms of traditional witchcraft that had never left. Like when I told my family, because they ask, when I told my family what I was writing my book about, my grandma immediately texted me and was like, your great great grandma Mandy Bill was a witch. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that, So there's these sort of rituals and practices that were never called neo-paganism, but had always existed.
Right.
Which I love. So why is yours set in a historical time period?
Well, I love writing historical fiction, and I had been doing it for a bit. So I had written a trilogy set near me in Seattle, set in the 1920s. But I wanted to go back further, and just I was really fascinated with how the persecution of witches, which posits that people actually believe in witchcraft, or you wouldn't go after them. So, and it's all about fear. Of course, it's fear of women's power. So I just wanted to go back and trace it from early days into a more modern period.
Actually, when I was doing, since the next thing we're going to talk about is sort of our research process, but when I was doing my research, I read a lot of the different sorts of anthropological historical theories about why witch burnings and witch persecutions were such incredibly strong trends in Western European history. Like between 1400 and 1700, something like 60,000 suspected witches were burned in Europe. That's a lot of people. Really that's significant. And I think the explanations that I liked the most were the ones that were essentially like, don't forget that they believed this. This wasn't all necessarily just channeling fear about women, although it was there, obviously, but like witchcraft was a real threat, like a perceived set of threats. And I feel like that belief can't be discounted. And I liked that.
And it became the way to define the other, to choose the other that you can blame for your ills. You can blame for the plague was a big problem because they had to blame someone for that, or they thought they did. So I think that's a big part of it. Also, this is a good place to mention that Queen Elizabeth's mother's ancestress was burned as a witch in Scotland in the 17th century, which is, I mean, that's comes awfully close to home. So I think that's
it does. Yeah, that's very late. 17th century is late for burning witches. We did it, obviously, in Salem.
Yes, we did. And witches went on being persecuted really into the 20th century, early 20th century with the last. They didn't burn them, but they shunned them, and they would be driven out of town and so forth. I think the last one, the exact date has escaped me. It was 1904 or 1906 or something. There's a contemporary account of it. So,
So what was your research process like?
oh, my research process is everything. So all of the above. I use the library, obviously. I use interlibrary loans, which are invaluable. I use the internet with caution, because a lot of it you can't trust. And a lot of it, I just dig around and, we call it going down the rabbit hole, right? I'm sure you do the same thing. You're looking for one little thing and you end up learning a whole bunch of other things along the way. One of my favorites was I was looking for the Queen Mum, Queen Elizabeth's mother. I wanted one line to describe her wedding ring. And I have this huge biography, I mean, just enormous and the most boring tome you could ever read, although she was not a boring woman. And I went through it. I spent an entire day going through that thing, looking for one mention of her wedding ring. And then I went on the internet and I found it in 30 seconds. So I will go anywhere. And I also talk to people who know things, because people love to talk. They love to share what they know. So my research is just everything. I go up and talk to cab drivers. I talk to police officers. I mean, just anyone I think might have an answer that I can use. How about you?
Yeah.
Are you more organized than I am?
No, I thought that I was. I thought at the beginning of these projects, I was like, I had my grad school training. I was going to be a historian for a while, and I was very like,
perfect.
ready. And I did the what I would do in grad school, which was start with sort of like sets of historiographies that I knew I needed to have. So like for like a suffragettes but witches story, I needed to have like a big idea, sets of theories about the women's movements, and I needed to have big ideas and theories about witch burnings and witch persecutions, and then I needed to somehow smash those together. And it was really hard and messy, and all of that theory just sort of kept expanding the story in my head to where it didn't fit into anything novel size. Like what I quickly discovered is that, and I knew this already from grad school, but it's different knowing things and knowing them for a novel, I'm sure you agree. But my main discovery is that there was no meaningful tiny slice I could take out of the women's movement and make it into a novel. Like so many of their achievements were small and incremental and fought state by state and city by city. The movement itself was vast. It covered 2 continents in a couple of centuries, and women as diverse as teetotalers and abolitionists, many of whom were fighting amongst each other the whole time. And none of that would fit into something that was a book that would still feel like it had a triumphal ending, you can't trace the whole fight for the vote. And even if I did, what's the vote really for in 1920? It's for upper class white women. And so that didn't even feel like a victory, even if I went for that. So I kind of quickly threw out a lot of my research and decided to do that thing. What I've been saying is that Mark Twain quote about history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. So I decided to make this book rhyme with history. And so it has a lot of references and stuff like that, but it's in a fictional city and the timeline is fictional. It's like a fully alternate world. It gave me the freedom to like actually make this thing a novel instead of like several volumes of research.
One of my hard and fast rules is, well, first of all, when I'm going to start a historical novel, I do some reading so I get into the period and understand. But then my rule is write the story and look up the details when you need them, because otherwise you spend all your time, as you're saying. Of course, my degrees are all in music, so they don't really help all that much. But otherwise you're just studying reams of material that'll never make it into the book, like me spending a whole day looking for a wedding ring description.
Yeah, I did. I spent a lot of time studying. Constance, are you here?
I think I'm here. Can you guys hear me? Oh my God.
Yes,
Woo! All right.
So real quickly, if you can just cover all of witchcraft, all of your research plans.
Oh my God. I certainly can't cover technology. My God.
Happens to everybody.
I know. Oh, my new Mac has caused me more problems than just about anything. So anyway, well, where did I leave off?
We're at the end of talking about our research process. If you want to talk about your research process for your historical witchy book.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty, I don't think I realized how difficult it was going to be to write a book with 4 different time periods in one book. And I think I was kind of dumb about that, and I just like dove right in. And for me, I went, all of my books, I mean, I'm a big researcher in terms of finding historical things, like, getting the historical research and then actually looking at texts from that time, or whether it's a film or whether it's a book, so I read a lot of Zola, and I watched a lot of 1930s films and things. But then I actually was pretty adamant that I had to go on site to wherever it was. So that that took me to France a lot. That took me to Taos, New Mexico, to Los Angeles. And I remember getting a tour guide in Los Angeles, and the tour guide said to me, "Oh my God, thank you so much, because like all I do is tour Calabasas and the Kardashians' house." And I was asking for, like, can you show me where Thelma Todd died? Can you show me where Carol Lombard lived? And he was like, "Thank you. Like, this was really great stuff." And so, but that was really nice. And like the Louvre guide that took me around, Montparnasse and Montmartre, she was, apparently they have to have like 7 years of tour guide training to be able to take you anywhere. And those were really nice little details that I got, like, that a woman could not walk down the street by herself and be an actual lady in Belle Epoque, France. And so that, that certainly informs the decisions that you make, in terms of, just little, again, I think people can get a little hung up on the historical research. It can bog down the book. It's those little things, like, like sometimes our heroines have to dress as boys to be able to move around the city. And those are the things I think that kind of inform little details like that. So.
Good.
I think the last one we have for all of us, or mostly for Louisa
yes.
and me.
That's for me though. I'm supposed to ask you guys. So I did not actually base my book on Salem. And so why do you both think that the gravity well in the center of witchy stories, especially for American witchy stories, is in the town of Salem? I would love to hear from both of you.
Well, for me, it was just, in order to write The Age of Witches, it was just a beginning point. And because I knew that the first woman who was hanged as a witch, she wasn't burned, she was hanged, had 2 daughters. And so it was just convenient, really. And it is solely American, because there are plenty of witch stories in Europe and in the British Isles that a person can use. And of course, everyone knows about it. So you don't have to explain about Salem. I mean, what with the Crucible, and I mean, it's entrenched in our literary awareness. So it makes it an easy choice.
That's basically what I was going to say. It's just that it gives you this shorthand, which, you've gotten all into your historical details, and you're like, ooh, I'm going to name this person after this woman who was burned in Scotland. They're not going to get that, which is fine. They don't have to. But people even know some of the names of witches who were hanged at Salem. Like I can have a Tituban sisterhood in my book, and everybody's like, Tituba, like, that rings a bell.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I even had a copy editor who I left out one of the girls who was an accuser of Bridget Bishop, and the copy editor wanted it in there, so that I had all 5 of them. So I was like, yes, ma'am, I'll do whatever you want.
Editors.
I do too.
And so then also, Alix, so you set your novel in the turn of the century America. So, I mean, so in addition to pulling some of the history of Salem, but, why that period of time? I mean, obviously, if I think I've heard you talk about before about, you're looking at the suffragette movement. So that was kind of narrowed down your choices, but, what kind of had you interested in that particular period of time?
Yeah, I mean, like if I wanted to do the suffrage movement, there's like many phases I could have picked. I chose this one in part because it's what I studied in grad school, and I'm very lazy. And so I already had like some basics, I had some like general knowledge about what's going on in the 1890s. But the reason that I studied it in grad school is because I find that period is sort of like a locus point for a lot of huge social changes. And maybe even more than changes, it is a time when a lot of power hierarchies get incredibly inflexible and sort of deeply rooted in society. So you have like all of these things that have been evolving throughout the Victorian era, a lot stricter gender hierarchy in some ways, a lot stricter vision of racial hierarchy, class hierarchy, all these things sort of by the late 19th century, people are extremely invested in them in new ways that I think make them particularly awful. The Comstock laws, things like that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And then for Louisa, I've certainly read where you were curious about how women were married off, exchanging their wealth for titles. I mean, so we talked a lot about power. I mean, I kind of missed some of that, but I think I know where you were all going with that. But talk a little bit about why that was such an interesting detail. I was doing some snooping on you in Goodreads, and so, I know. So what was why was that of particular interest to you from that historical time frame? It was an interesting little tinder there.
I have to confess, it was the thing that got me started was Downton Abbey. I was just such a huge fan of that program. And I know they took liberties with historical fact, but one of the characters is actually an American woman who came to England and married someone with a title because he needed money. And it has a lot to do with, and my novel is set entirely in the Gilded Age. It all takes place in 1890. So in the Gilded Age is kind of the last gasp of the aristocracy. And one of the reasons it's the last gasp is they didn't have any money anymore. They couldn't sustain that lifestyle. And as part of their sort of last attempts to hold on to it, there was all this money with people who were not aristocracy, but who had built business fortunes in the United States. And so it was just like a steady traffic of girls who would be brought to England to meet the eligible aristocrats, and they would marry them in exchange for the family would acquire a title. It could say, oh, my daughter or my sister-in-law or whatever is a lady or a duchess or whatever, but in exchange for a huge dowry. And that it was like a small business that went on for, I would say, probably 30 years or so, where that was really an active thing. There were women in London who their whole profession was introducing these girls to the eligible young men. It was just a very, very strange thing. And it made me, as I said in our email, it made me remember this quote I heard a long time ago from some feminist that being on a pedestal sounds great, but it's just a very tiny prison. And so these girls would go over, they'd acquire the title, everybody's happy, their family has the title, the other family has the money, and there they are, they don't know anybody, they don't have friends.
Right.
They didn't marry because they loved someone, they married for business reasons.
Yeah.
It's a very strange process and very anti-feminist in my view.
Yeah.
It does make me very curious because that feels like a similar era to like romance novels as a genre. Weren't they kind of emerging in roughly that same time? And I wonder about the classic romance novel thing of like marrying a duke or like, getting that title.
Right.
That makes me really curious where the roots of that are.
Yeah, I think, I'm sure we feel titles are overrated, especially now.
Yeah. I think we had,
I think I was going to ask Alix something, but we've kind of touched on it already, about the connection between the suffrage movement and early American feminism. Yeah. And you mentioned the Comstock laws. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, especially as of yesterday, especially this connection between the women's movement, the nascent women's movement in the 19th century, early 19th century even, and the urge of the patriarchy to control it. And the Comstock laws were one of their principal tools. And so you kind of went right there with your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we often have an idea of the past as being sort of universally oppressive towards women. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think it varies hugely from period to period. There's moments of liberalism, there's moments of equality, and then there's moments of sort of strange reactive repressiveness. Not that I'm thinking of any particular era that we're in right now. And I just think that that's sort of the pendulum swing of history a little bit. I also think battles over gender equality never happen in a vacuum, and they're often in reaction to or in tandem with racial justice movements. Thinking about the 1890s as an era in particular and the Comstock laws, those are happening post-Reconstruction America. And that is a very particular time when people are interested in reasserting a hierarchy because they feel like they have lost one recently. So,
Right. Well, that was addressed in your book, certainly. And then Constance, in A Witch in Time, I find it so interesting you took a different approach because it's really one character. When I did my generational thing, it was a different woman for each generation. But yours is so interesting because it's one character through all these different periods. And I think her sacrifices that she makes in trying to break free of that cycle are pretty intense. And I don't know if you think of it this way, but I think of Lucien as kind of a symbolic of the patriarchy. And there were times, just as Alix was saying, there were times when he was kind and times when he wasn't. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into it.
No, you are.
When we read something, we bring a lot of our own, I mean, it's as it should be, right? The reader brings her own impressions, her own thoughts into the story.
I think you're right. I remember, one of the earlier drafts where the Juliet story, which is in 1895 in France, and it's very similar in the fact that you had a lot of people trying to hold on to a period of time in France. It just was a little bit different in Europe than it was in the U.S. But you had, I remember somebody saying to me that I wrote a fairy tale. And, looking back on it, I think he kind of comes as a rescuer figure for this girl who has less than nothing. And she, kind of goes to the door almost as an orphan, and she's rings the doorbell and having no idea what's going to happen to her. And he serves as a rescuer. Now, albeit he is a demonic rescuer, but he really does that. By the end of the book, and then you have, the next time period that they meet again is Hollywood in the 1930s. Again, that was a very interesting time period for me, just because it actually kind of represented kind of the feminine ideal on screen was kind of created at that point. And then you almost have her recreated in that scene. And in that sense, she and Luke at that point are kind of in love. That's probably their golden age. And then you have her in the 70s with him, really pushing back on him, really pushing back against the patriarchy, exactly what you're saying. And that, I think, was for me very interesting, because you don't get to the end, and I won't give away the ending, but I mean, she almost transcends him at the end. So, and I was definitely making a statement about the fact that she did not need him anymore. And it was a hopeful thing in the fact that I not that we don't have ways to go, but I mean, I was so angry when I would read things. I mean, when you read any Zola, or you read anything, I mean, it's women had so little opportunities afforded to them outside of marriage, just like I think we've all talked about. And if you were, trying to make a living or trying to, I mean, the fallen woman was just, I mean, there was just nowhere for people to go. And so I did try to, I mean, I think in the Juliet story, I try to box her in very much. And I do that with a heavy-handed way, I think, because I am trying to prove a point that she did not have many options available to her, and then he rescues her. I wasn't crazy about the fact that he was a rescuer of her, but I do like where it ended up at the end, and that was a very conscious choice.
Well, and isn't that an interesting thing where we don't love now the narrative of a man rescuing a woman, but like in moments where women are rendered powerless, it's kind of that's the reason they're being rescued, Yeah.
And the fact that she was away, it had to be magic. I mean, she was in such a predicament that the only thing that could get her out of it was either magic or a man. So I had both of those kind of come to her rescue. But, that was my choice to make that a very magical. I wanted her to have, I mean, so few women had that. And so I wanted that kind of as a choice. For me, that was the choice of the fantasy there, was to just kind of give, I just read so many bleak stories and you're just like, oh God, this is horrible. And I wanted something that just was a little bit more hopeful, even if it was dark magic that kind of put that in, and I hoped that I was going to be correcting that as the stories went on, and did to some degree in some stories and then some not. So I think we actually talk about magic here. Yeah.
Actually, we only have like maybe 5 or 10 minutes left. And so I think I'm going to condense I had questions for both of you, but I feel like I'm going to ask the same one of both of you, because it's something that I really struggled with in my witch book, and which you just brought up, which is sort of balancing the hopefulness and the bleakness. I had a really hard time writing this book. I think it was because we existed in a bleak world, and I was thinking about very heavy stuff. The history of women's suffrage is not particularly light, Things didn't always work out for those activists, and the history of witchcraft the same way. How did you guys balance the hopefulness and the bleakness in your work?
Well, for me, the 3 witch books that I've written are all quite different. And so A Secret History of Witches, there's a balance back and forth all through. And then I think that The Witch's Kind is actually one of the darkest of my novels, because the challenges were so insurmountable and there was tragedy to deal with. When I wrote the Age of Witches, I really intended it for it to be lighter. So And I really like the idea that I mentioned Cinderella earlier. I used to teach writing to kids, and I would say, if you're going to write Cinderella, you want her to save herself. Don't have somebody else save her. And I feel that in a way, in The Age of Witches, my protagonist saved herself with some help and with magic. But
Yeah.
so
I think in my book, I have 2 darker and 2 lighter periods. And one, the overarching, I even try to make it a bit comical to lighten the load a little bit. And that was a struggle, as you know, as you're trying to like keep them balanced from a just from a continuity standpoint. I tried to do that, but at the same time, I wanted the release valve to come off a little bit, particularly during Nora. It comes off a little bit. I think that's a lighter story, and I think that Helen is a lighter story. Juliet is a really dark story, and I think Sandra is a very, very dark story. So I tried to. So for me, I actually kind of went for it with both themes, but I tried to kind of balance them a little bit enough so that it wasn't uneven from an editing standpoint. And hopefully we achieved that. But at the end, I agree with Louisa. At the end, I wanted them to be able. I wanted her to rescue herself at the end. And I think that, and to become whole. I mean, so at the end, my goal also is that she becomes whole, that she's not all these disparate parts of women out there. But the one thing I think that for my book in particular, Alix, is I also was really excited about the fact that I wanted her to be a witness to history and how cool would that be? I mean, all of us, I mean, obviously we love history. I think you were a history major, even Alix. But I mean, how cool would it have been to have seen the changes, if you've lived back in from the 1890s on? To me, that's really exciting. And so, I mean, I kind of wanted a little bit of a voyeur view of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I pitched the book, I was like, ooh, suffragists but witches. That sounds so fun. And then I got into it and I was like, it's not fun at all. That's a huge bummer. And I sort of lost a little bit of that shine. Just, unless you're going to write about the most privileged of the suffrage movement, who suffered almost no consequences because they weren't even that radical in the first place, and boring, I'm not going to write about them. Then you've got your Alice Pauls and your Pankhursts, and they suffered, and I didn't want to write women force-fed in prison cells or forced to leave their countries or losing daughters in jail. Like, I didn't want any of that. But it becomes difficult because you want to accurately represent the history, but you don't want to, you don't want to sugarcoat it, but you don't want to revel in the trauma of the past,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess we should it looks like there's a few questions, maybe Ellen will come back.
Good.
Yeah. So the first question we have is from Jessa Lantern, very good name, which is, who were some of the most interesting real-life women you discovered in your historical research? And Alix, you just mentioned some names, so maybe you want to start with that one.
I did. So, I mean, obviously Alice Paul and Pankhurst are the sort of American and English versions of the same extreme sort of deeds, not words, vision of the suffragists who went all the way for it. But one of my actual favorites is the Woodhull sisters, Victoria Woodhull. If you don't know who she is, she's so worth a Google. She's fantastic. She's technically America's first female candidate for president. But she was just a huge radical. She read fortunes and did magnetic healing in the 1890s. Was definitely a prostitute for a while. Then joined the suffrage movement and was buddies with a bunch of prominent abolitionists. She's fantastic. Total character.
So I can't say that I encountered any real people that I got to know all that well, other than just borrowing. Well, I mentioned Queen Elizabeth herself. That is the Queen Mum. Was really fun to get to know, even though her biography was so boring. But I mean, somebody needed an editor there. But she herself was a fascinating person and a really strong personality, and that was fun. That was in Secret History of Witches. Otherwise, I pretty much just borrowed from people's life stories in order to make my characters historically as close to believable as possible.
Mm-hmm. For me, for Belle Epoque, Suzanne Valdon was a really interesting. She was Eric Satie, the composer,
Oh yes.
his girlfriend, and I very tragic story. And I my guide was telling me about this as I was not paying attention because I was not focused on Suzanne Valdon, and then I would go back and find Eric Satie, and then somehow get walked to Suzanne Valdon, and it was like all roads led there. And so that to me was very interesting. Just that whole Montparnasse and Montmartre scene, and with all the writers all living there, and Picasso was still living up there, and it was just a very really interesting time. For Hollywood, also, I was just haunted by the Carol Lombard, Jean Harlow, Thelma Todd. Those are some really tragic stories, and old Hollywood has this like esoteric kind of mysteriousness to it, and that you don't really ever really know how anyone died. And so there is just this like really strange, I mean, they covered everything up so much that it's just a really interesting thing. And so that to me was definitely weighing in. So I actually did use a lot of like real characters, and then Mabel Luhan Dodge for, I think, Taos. I mean, she was just a real pioneer, and anybody who moved to Taos at that period of time was a real pioneer. So that probably those are, I think, were the main ones.
The next question is a fun one. Jeremy asks, what would you say are the most important and/or entertaining works of fiction about witches, besides your own, of course?
Ooh, well, entertaining, I don't know, but informative. I think I know this Jeremy, and he would ask this question. There's something called the Penguin Book of Witches, which is a transcription of the Salem witch trials, which is fascinating in itself, but it's transcribed so that it's readable because the original language is really difficult. But the book is worth having in your library just for the foreword, which is a beautiful assessment of witches and the persecution of witches and the way they fit into
Mm-hmm.
the pattern of culture. So that's one.
I think
That's not a
Anne,
novel.
Anne Rice for me, the Wishing Hour was
Oh,
my favorite.
yeah,
Was
right.
my favorite Anne Rice book. Period. End of story. I mean, I just think it was a masterpiece.
Those are a higher brow. I'm going to say Practical Magic, not the
Oh,
book, the
so
movie.
fun.
Okay, because that is what was formative for me. And also, actually, Circe. I think that it is
Yeah.
a culmination of so many of sort of the witch books that came before it, and a reinterpretation of mythology in a really brilliant, empowering way. I just really love that book.
Yeah. And
And there's
Sabrina's,
there's
yeah,
the Merlin material. There's several
Yeah.
different books that deal with the Merlin legend, which are, the titles are escaping me at this moment, but which are really good.
Mhm.
Cut my teeth on those.
And I think a lot of people found Mists of Avalon sort of
Yeah.
a significant early
That's one,
witch
yeah,
book,
that's-
and I know that author is like deeply troubled, and
Yes.
that's
Very
been
controversial.
very bummed me out about that book. But I think it's still like for a lot of girls in a particular era growing up, you find that and you're like, oh my god, this isn't about King Arthur at all. Forget that guy.
Yeah,
It's
right,
fantastic.
exactly. It's a great book.
All right, our next question is about research, but specifically witchy research. How do you do your witchy research in regards to spell work, herbs, rituals, etc.? That's a question from Tina.
I just read everything I could find about how people create spells, and then I got myself a good book on herbalism and pretty much made it up. I did buy something called the Big Blue Book of Witchcraft, which is a Wiccan publication, and I didn't find it helpful. I mean, I guess it works if that's the practice you want, but I just ended up fictionalizing everything with from an informed position.
And that was something you really wanted to do, though, for this book, right? That was you had an interest in that for this particular book, right? You wanted to be focusing a lot on the herbs,
Right,
And
in
yeah.
the Age of Witches, absolutely, because I wanted her to be an herbalist. And along the way, I've almost become an herbalist myself. I learned so much, and there are such wonderful books. And I actually think herbs are being underutilized in a lot of health practices in America today. And it's surprising how effective they can be without the disastrous side effects that traditional medicines bring. So it was really worthwhile study.
Yeah. I looked like a crazy person on Amazon. If you looked at my Amazon cart when I was writing, you know, I mean, I looked like a seriously disturbed person. Like like your suggested reading was like, you know, just because I like you, I read everything I could, and a lot of times it didn't make sense. So a lot of times you are just, I don't know that I want to copy anything so closely too. So you kind of make it up a little bit too. But you know, everything has to be kind of grounded on research. But sometimes your research makes your suggested reading pile look a little strange.
Yeah, I did basically the same. I didn't use any actual word for word like spells that I found either historically or sort of in modern witchcraft practices. Partly because like I know some of them feel very deeply spiritually about it, and I don't actually want to take anybody's spiritual practice just because I wanted a suffragette to do something fun in my fictional novel. I do have a number of hippie-ish witchy friends, one of whom works on a serious, huge, large-scale herb farm, like bottling lavender and shipping it out to places and like all these different things. So I would call her sometimes and be like, "Is this a thing? Like, can you use that for that? Damn it!" And then try again. So that my research was a little less formal. I also do have a huge herb garden myself, not for medicinal or witchcraft purposes, but just because I really like them and I cook a lot, or my husband does.
The next question is from Elise, who asks, how has the collective and personal perception of witches changed while you've been writing on the topic? And I'm going to editorialize a little bit because I've been wondering about how you all think about the distinction between good and bad witches, because there's some fiction with good witches, some with bad witches. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I want to quote one of my own characters. I just saw this line the other day and I was like, oh, I wrote that? That's good. I like that.
I love it when that happens.
I literally don't remember writing it, but one of the witchy characters says something like, wickedness is like beauty in the eye of the beholder. And that's like gotta be kind of true, right? Like, particularly if you think of witchcraft like some sort of essential elemental force that is there to be harnessed, then wouldn't it be distributed like every other kind of power in our society, used for good sometimes and bad sometimes, and unequal access to it and all that stuff?
So I wrote, in Secret History of Witches, I wrote one bad witch, one witch who used her abilities and her knowledge to get things just the way she wanted them and without regard for whom it hurt. And I heard from a number of readers how much they didn't like Irene. I think of it as Irene, which was the French pronunciation, but they didn't like that character. But for me, that was one of the most fun characters to write in the entire book. And it's a big, long book. I think it's really fun to drop the restraints of trying to write a sympathetic character and just go for it with all the evil impulses that every human being probably has somewhere in their psyche. We just mostly restrain it. So that was fun for me. I like that. Mostly, I think the witches I know and the witches I've written mostly are people who are just trying to make their intentions come to pass, which is the same as a prayer. Call it a spell, call it an intention, whatever. But so.
Yeah. I think for mine, I make a distinction. I think they're, I have kind of the more demonic bend, but those are mostly actual Puron demons. And then I have witches who I think are not, they're kind of, as Louisa just said, like victims of circumstance in a way. And I have, I think one of the funnier things and one of the lighter things in my book is that I have a witch who's not very good. And so she stumbles into something bad because because she actually doesn't have the technique and doesn't have the skill or the knowledge. And so she actually bumbles something in a kind of a very Aunt Clara kind of way. And so, I think my witches I'm pretty sympathetic about. Now in the next book, not so much. So, but for Witch in Time, for sure, I tried to make a distinction between what I thought were more demonic things and things that were just trying to get by with what you had.
I noticed we did just totally forget the first part of this question, which is how the perception of witches has changed while we've been writing. So I'll just say that, the fact that this panel exists to me is evidence that many of us were having similar feelings in the last 4 or so years. Again, just choosing dates off the top of my head. And channeling them in similar ways. And I think when you grow up sort of like having witches in the margins of all your stories, it feels sort of inevitable that there would be sort of a dragging to the center. And of course, we're dealing with a lot of the same themes. Witches lend themselves to those themes.
Yeah.
Well, to me, the idea that a lot of people are very open about being witches and about being part of covens tells you how much things have changed in the last, say, 75 years. We're kind of forgetting the Wizard of Oz too, which took the good witch and the bad witch in really black and white contrast, and that is early 20th century. So, we can see how far we had come by that time. This thing keeps coming back to me, is that people, when they talk about witch hunt and they want to call women calling each other witches, is not an insult, but it can be used as an insult, and it means people take it seriously. And I actually really like that, because it's respecting the power of it.
Well, I think too, since I wrote the book that I wrote, which has a witch in the title, people have come up to me much more, and you're really surprised. People, and plus mine has a kind of a layer of reincarnation and other kind of spiritual things kind of going into it. So I've just been really surprised about the people who've kind of, come to me and said like, oh my God, like I practice or like this really speaks to me. And I've been just really kind of moved by that, because, I wasn't expecting that, I don't think. And so from my perception has changed, just for the fact that I think that people have shared their stories with me. And I think that it's been, I think it's a very empowering thing for people to either have a practice of being a witch, and I've been very moved by that. And I was surprised. I just wasn't expecting that. I think when I started to write a book, when you write a book about witches, you have to be open to that, because that is going to happen. So.
All right. Our next question is also from Elise, who asks, how did the persecution or ostracization of witches impact your work on the topic?
Well, not to give away my own ending, but there's some actual persecution of witches in my book. For me, that was sort of the really bleak research that I was mired in for a really long time. It seemed like the inevitable ending to every witch story to me. And I wanted to find a way where the witches got to sort of reclaim that ending and make it a moment of power rather than a moment of persecution. So again, I got all tangled up in spoiling my own book, but I thought about it a lot.
Well, I think the fact that witches are persecuted traditionally, as a person who's writing fiction, you have an automatic tension point to start with. And so it was both true and also useful in creating a story.
And it isn't just women. It was ethnic groups, and it was, it was anybody who was an other. If you were othered, you were vulnerable, you were susceptible. So it's just vulnerable people. And so I think, looking at history and looking at the people who were the most vulnerable, they were often just accused of things for a variety of reasons. And it wasn't just, I think as Louisa said, it wasn't just women, it was mostly women, but it was men, or it was just, ethnic groups across Europe. So in different times. So yeah, I think that's just, something that is, prevalent in anyone who writes about witches. I think you research that, that, and that's definitely part of when you're building a narrative of somebody who is vulnerable. It makes sense.
We have a related question from Tina, who asks, have any of you suffered any backlash for writing with witches as your topic?
Other than I have a day job, so other than the eye rolls and stuff from my from my colleagues who've been very supportive, but it's I'm the woman that writes those witch books, so which I'm completely fine with and really happy about. So no, I can't say that. I think it's all been very positive, nothing negative. But I haven't had yet the bad email about my witches and my demons. I'm waiting for that.
Guys, well, I've had one or two.
I know. I think you have. I know. That's why I'm. Yeah.
I've had one or two of those, but I just don't pay any attention. The thing that really surprised me, as you were saying, Connie, is the way people approach you because you've opened this topic up.
Mhm.
And people, I love this, that readers reach out to me and they say, I'm a witch and I'm doing this, I'm doing that.
Mhm.
And they share their practice with me, which I adore. But
Mhm.
sometimes they ask me questions and they think I know something.
Right.
And because I'm creating fiction, mostly I don't, with one notable exception, this darling young woman, it was in Calgary in Canada. And she came up to me and said, do you have any advice for a young witch? Well, of course, my immediate response is, well, I don't have anything, except that then she started telling me her story. And it turned out I really did. There really was something, I won't go into it, but there was really something I had to offer her from my own experience and from people I know. It was one of the, I'll never forget it. It was like this, a moment of magic. And I treasure it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't had any particular pushback, except in the, I mean, like, you know, if you're a woman on the internet, you're going to get some weird stuff. And particularly, I think more if you were a woman who is writing sci-fi and fantasy, there's a particular little group of sci-fi and fantasy fans that sometimes makes nasty blog posts and thinks you should stop writing that and ruining their genre. But like, other than that, not really. And I mean, they're just losing. I don't know. Last year, every nominee for Best Novel on the Hugo list was a woman. So
how could that happen when half the population is female? Well, that's how
All right,
we
we've
all
got a
got
couple-
into this, isn't it?
We've got a couple of research-related questions. Natalie asks, what small piece of interesting research you picked up along the way had the biggest impact on your writing or on your story?
I think I missed a keyword in the question. What small what?
What small piece of interesting research?
Oh, okay.
I think for me it was, and I found this out with a previous series, not with The Age of Witches, but it was discovering that the Comstock laws came about in such close juxtaposition to the suffragette movement, to the early American feminism. That's actually not a little thing, that's a big thing. But it's really affected me strongly, and I've been thinking about it ever since. And I expect it's going to show up in all my work going forward, because I made that link between the effort of women to be free and the desire of some people to, not all men either, some of them are women, to stop that. That's not a small thing. So.
Yeah, I think for me there was a famous duel between, which I actually kind of fictionalized in Witch and Time, and that was really interesting because it was around the period of time. For me, it was less about one thing, and I think I may have mentioned this in other things, which is that when you start to write about a period of time, you'll find little snippets that kind of play into the period of time. Will be like, oh, like that, oh, that fits, oh, that fits too, and it's almost like an illuminated pathway for you. So when you're trying to pick out like what time period you're going to write in, sometimes it's a little, it's just not on firm footing. And so you're trying to figure out kind of like, okay, did I make the right choice? Should I move it 10 years or back, or whatever. And so for me, sometimes I'll find like a couple things are just right in the sweet spot. Like, for example, there was a huge, Belle Epoque is very interesting in France because you had this real push between occultists, and you had a bunch of books that were written at the time, and you had some strange duels happening between people calling each other Satanists, all happening within a 3-year time period. And you start to kind of see that, and it reaffirms like where you have like anchored the book. And so for me, those are just like little, like when I find a nugget like that, and I did the same thing in 1970 in Los Angeles, you'd find these little nuggets, and it was just really amazing. And it just made you like kind of reaffirmed why you picked the time that you did. And it's just so surprising that it actually works out. So it's a little gift.
My favorite tiny little gift is that I was writing a scene. I needed there to be like a secret clue. And I was like, okay, it'll be in like a sewing sampler from Salem. And then I Googled like Salem sewing sampler. And there's a famous one done by a kid that is so creepy because like kids embroidery kind of is automatically creepy. And it was like perfect. I was like, yes. Thank you.
Yeah. But you live for those. You live for those little tiny moments, and you kind of throw it out there, and sometimes it comes back, and that's like a great validation.
All All right, there's another research-related question. We don't have a ton of time left to do this one justice, but Nicole asks, how much research or accuracy did you feel you needed in your fictional work?
I'll go first and say none.
Okay, I'll say 100%.
So we've got the range covered.
Right. I hate getting anything. If it's a historical detail, I turn myself inside out trying to get it right. And sometimes it's really hard because they can be really obscure.
No, I mean, I'm probably 90%. I mean, sometimes it just doesn't work out and you want to fictionalize it, but for the most part, I try to anchor it as much as I can.
That's what I did with my first book, and everything, every little date in there is perfect. You know, I looked up the train schedules, and for the second one, I was like, you know what? I'm not doing it. This is an alternate. If there had been witches, real witches, it would have so screwed up the timeline that I am allowed to do anything that I want.
That's
so,
great.
you know, there's instead of the triangle shirtwaist fire, there's a square shirtwaist fire. I'm allowed to do that stuff. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, there's a question about signed copies of your books, knowing that this is more rare during COVID. I dropped a link in the questions for Alix has some signed books with Mysterious Galaxy right now. Louisa and Connie, are there any bookstores near you that have signed books right now?
Some Barnes and Nobles that I've been able to go to. I mean, it's all West Coast, right? So it's way over here in the upper left corner of the country. That's
I think
do. I mean, I think if anybody's open to a nameplate, to a book plate, that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's really disappointing, and I'm sorry.
I think Politics and Prose in Washington has some of mine, but again, like, you know, the book plate option is also something I'm totally open to as well.
I'll put the Orbit email address in the comments. If anyone is interested in taking them up on that offer, I can pass along that information. So just shoot us an email there. All right, and we're running very low on time. So one final fun question to wrap things up. This is also from Jess Lantern, who asks, if your herons dressed up as another fictional witch for Halloween, who would they dress up as?
Oh, I know. James Juniper would be Serafina Pecola.
Oh.
My favorite witch. One of my favorite witches.
I don't know who that is.
Oh, wow, then you were not a middle schooler during the time when the Golden Compass books came out.
True, I was not. Wow, that is a fun question. I don't have an answer.
I think Nora would be Glenda. Yeah, Nora would be Glenda.
Like that. Well, I could have Irene be the Wicked Witch of the West? The one who got, I have those striped stockings for Halloween that I always put out that look like my house fell on her. So I always put those out at Halloween.
Yeah. Cool.
All right, that's great. So I think we're all out of time, unfortunately. Sorry to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for bearing with us through the technical difficulties that started us out. No, not your fault. Glad we got everyone on screen. Don't forget to click on the green button at the bottom of your screen to buy all the author's books and follow Orbit on Crowdcast to be notified about upcoming virtual events. And have a great evening, everyone, and happy Halloween. Thanks again.
Bye.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.